Good morning, A-pushers. The purpose of this video is to take a look at topic 7.10, the New Deal. We're going to do a little recap of the first 100 days on the New Deal with relief, recovery, and reform, and then we're going to push ahead to the second New Deal and the opponents and critics of the New Deal, and, well, just kind of establish the idea that not everybody is on the same page with what the New Deal should be doing. Here we go. Okay, so very briefly, these are the three slides that we looked at in our class discussion about this. Just a very quick overview and recap on this end of things. It is important that you know the three R's on this of relief, recovery, and reform. It is also important that you are keeping track of the idea of deficit spending in the sense that the federal government is going to incur debt because of their plans that they're putting into place to try to fight the Great Depression. And it is also important that we take a little bit of an evaluative look at this. I meaning, got to have some sort of judgment over how successful some of these programs are, because that is precisely the kind of thing that the College Board would be asking you to do in an LEQ kind of format about the Great Depression. So whether you're talking about relief, recovery, reform in the banking and money programs, or what they're doing to try to help out trying to help out unemployed workers and get them back to work, and trying to help out businesses and try to get them to be more stabilized. There's a certain sense of evaluation that we need to think about all the way through this. It is important for me to say one more time that everything that we saw on 7.10a on that end of it, all of that's really coming out through the first 3 months of FDR's presidency, because there is an effort to try to do as much as possible in as short a time as possible to try to fix the economy. What happens is, like going through 1933 into 1934, there are definitely some criticisms of these programs, but the programs are put in place to see what kind of effect they're going to have. And by the time you get to the 1934 congressional elections, you end up with even more Democrats and pro-Roosevelt supporters being elected into office. And so by the time you get to 1935, there's another wave of these programs that come through. Here I'm calling it the second New Deal. In the video that everybody watched back on Friday, they were referring to it as the second 100 days. It's not quite the same sort of flurry of activity within like a short period of time, but there are some definite echoes between the first wave and this second wave of New Deal programs. I am categorizing a couple of these elements for you here. So in the category of relief, relief is trying to give assistance to people that are in need of immediate relief. And so we're talking about jobs. In 1935, the federal government creates the Works Progress Administration. The W on this, it shows up in like a few of these like acronyms that come up, but W usually stands for works, as in trying to put people back to work. And so within this, there's like the Public Works Administration, which comes in and they're giving more money to states to try to do highway construction and government building construction. And there's dozens of post offices and courthouses that are built during the 1930s as part of a WPA project. But what's different about this one than just before, like in the first New Deal, it was really dedicated to just like almost like an emergency level. We got to put people back to work. This time around, they're expanding the type of work that they're giving. So there are things like the Federal Arts Project and the Federal Theater Project as part of the WPA. The idea here is that not everybody is going to like be able to go get a job in construction. There's got to be some other type of work that can be had. And so the federal government is going to commission like different types of arts projects coming in. So for the arts, the picture here on the lower right, there is a WPA band that is playing at a 4th of July festival, and they are being paid to do this. They were being paid to kind of go out and try to generate some positive patriotic feelings. The Federal Theater Project is going to put out posters like the one here for the Big Tent Theater on the by the Federal Theater Players, right? About Abraham Lincoln, the great commoner, trying to portray an American ideal about what's going on. The poster there in the top right corner about like the danger signals of cancer. This is being designed by artists in the 1930s, trying to give artists and actors and theater producers and musicians and painters options on where they can go be commissioned to create go create their works of art in a way that it can be good for the overall society, not just as a way to kind of get people jobs, but as a way to, well, get people jobs that are going to have a benefit to everybody else, which is, I mean, I think it's a nice idea. It definitely comes with controversy because who's to say that my version of what would be a good message to create with an Abe Lincoln play, what if that doesn't fit with somebody else's version of an Abe Lincoln message that should be sent out? So there's definitely some politics and criticism that comes in with this, but it really is like a step in a direction towards a little bit of national unity at the same time as creating jobs. There are also jobs being created specifically for young Americans, teenagers. The idea here is, I mean, school attendance is dropping in the 1930s because as you have unemployment, you have families that are dipping into poverty, you've got teenagers that are leaving school to go to work. So the NYA is going to set up programs around schools that are going to give incentives for businesses that are close by to school to hire young people to take those jobs. And in order to be eligible to take those jobs, you have to be a student at that local school. So it's encouraging people to stay in school, therefore, opening up more job opportunities for more grown Americans or adult Americans, and it's kind of helping the local economy around those schools. So like it's another one of these multi-layer benefits that comes in with this. All of these works programs, whether it's first New Deal or second New Deal, they're all designed for relief, which also means that they are all designed to be temporary. The second R on this in the New Deal, the second R is recovery. And there are less recovery measures in the second New Deal. It's more about trying to provide that immediate relief or look towards those long-term goals to try to, well, prevent this from happening again in the future. So 3 big changes that come in for the reforms of the second New Deal. All of them still around, at least in spirit, these days. One is the creation of the Social Security Administration. The idea of establishing an old age pension that you pay tax dollars and your employer pays tax dollars towards Social Security, and then when you turn 65, you can retire and receive a government pension. This is something that European countries had been establishing back in the 1870s and 1880s in Germany on the early side of this. That's Otto von Bismarck doing that if you're a fan of the old Euro class. But in the United States, it takes until the 1930s. And the Social Security Administration, my little asterisk there is reminding everybody that this is something that is still on the books these days as a way to protect Americans. It also has a little bit of a relief component of the 1930s, because when I turn 65, if I'm eligible to retire and collect Social Security, well, that means I am freeing up a job for somebody else in the workforce. And so there's this little bit of a double dip. Social Security benefits are paid by future Social Security taxes, and so it should be a self-replicating system. There are always, like in more modern times, there are kind of consistent concerns about the funding in Social Security, but in the 1930s, it is seen as being a resounding success for this part of the New Deal. The federal government is also going to put in place the National Labor Relations Act. Sometimes you'll see it called the Wagner Act because that is the congressional author to this. Is Congressman, I feel like his first name is Robert, but you can fact check me on that and correct me in class if you want to. But this is going to create the National Labor Relations Board. There's the logo there. Still around today, the purpose of the NLRB is to make sure that if there are threats of strikes or threats of unfair treatment of workers, this is something that the federal government can intervene in and make sure that is going to be consistent, not just for the benefit of those workers or those businesses, but consistent for the benefit of the overall economy. And the NLRB, it has shown up in news in the past couple of years as workers at Amazon factories and at Starbucks locations have tried to go through the process of unionizing with different levels of success. But the NLRB has been involved with those conversations pretty steadily over the last couple of years. And then finally is the Fair Labor Standards Act. Technically speaking, this law is not still on the books. It's been replaced over years, but this is the law that establishes for the first time ever the idea of a federal minimum wage. So the minimum wage as it was set up in 1938 was in the neighborhood of 40 cents an hour. That's somewhere around $5 or $6 an hour by today's standards. So the minimum wage has gone up over time. Still controversy about how much, or let's not call it controversy, let's call it political debate over how much the minimum wage should be. But the idea of a minimum wage and a standard 44-hour work week, that is coming into play here in the 1930s. So this is something that is definitely going to hold true for generations to come. Good examples of long-term changes that come out because of the New Deal. But please don't make the mistake that just because all this stuff is happening, that it means that everybody wants this to happen exactly this way. Anytime there is a government decision being made, there are going to be critics of it. So we can put the critics of the New Deal, the opponents of the New Deal, into a couple of categories. There are conservatives that feel like they need to shrink the size of the government because the government getting too big could represent a violation of rights. These are conservatives that are trying to limit the scope of the New Deal. For example, the Supreme Court has gone through a couple of different times, actually, and had a couple of New Deal programs declared unconstitutional. The National Recovery Administration was declared unconstitutional in the case of Schechter versus United States. That's the sick chicken case. And then the Agricultural Adjustment Administration is declared unconstitutional in the case of Butler versus United States. Look, those two cases and those two government Supreme Court decisions, it's really got to do with limiting the scope and the power of the federal government. The fear that there's too much regulation coming in what really you can argue should be a laissez-faire kind of government system. So the Supreme Court definitely stands as an opponent to the New Deal. More on that in 10C coming up in a couple of slides. There are also Republicans in Congress. It is a flurry of legislation that comes out because the Democrats in Congress, FDR's party, they've got such a strong majority, but there are still Republicans in Congress that are crying foul that this is too much government action that's taking place. So they don't do much to kind of slow things down like the Supreme Court does, but there's still that opposition that is there. And then there's the American Liberty League. The ALL is an organization of business owners that were involved with some of the protests and complaints towards the National Recovery Administration. And they're kind of loud critics and opponents of various pieces of New Deal legislation throughout the 1930s. So on the conservative side, it kind of fits into like these little categories. On the liberal side of things, there are more, I'm going to call them socialistic critics of the New Deal that want the New Deal to go even further in its change of the economic system. So there are radical socialists in the 1930s that are pushing this. In the video from Friday in class, they talked about the growth of the Communist Party in the United States. We will talk about that in some future units a little bit later on down the road. There are labor unions like the United Mine Workers Union that is trying to go, they're conducting more strikes and trying to demand greater calls for New Deal protections for them. It is actually these strikes and this union activity that's going to lead to the passage of the Wagner Act in 1935 to try to give a greater voice towards labor unions. So sometimes these changes that are being asked for, you see them reflected in what's going on. There are also populist movements. These are sometimes referred to as demagogues, people like critics that are maybe just more about making themselves out to be a potential hero and solver for the problems of the country. kind of working outside of the standard political system. There is Father Charles Coughlin. It might be pronounced Coughlin. I've heard it pronounced two different ways. He is a radio revivalist from the 1920s that is openly critical about the overreach that the New Deal represents. He is hugely popular for a few years, but by 1936 his popularity wanes because he is kind of taking some increasing anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish rhetoric on his radio program, and by the end of the 1930s he is kind of fitting into that category of maybe a little bit of a Hitler Nazi supporter when it comes down to World War II developments in the late 1930s. More on that in some later topics. Second on our list is Dr. Francis E. Townsend. He's a medical doctor from California. He promotes an idea of an old age pension program, kind of like Social Security. He is promoting this before the Social Security Administration goes into effect, and I think you can make a clear argument that his recommendation here achieves such great popularity among Americans that it leads to the creation of Social Security. And then there is Huey P. Long, the governor of Louisiana, that promotes the Share Our Wealth societies. The idea that he wants to take money from the richest Americans and redistribute it to the poorest Americans, which is really kind of like big on rhetoric and short on details. He is hugely popular and looks like he could be a challenger for the presidency in 1936 if he hadn't been assassinated in the state capitol in Louisiana in 1935. The popularity of these populist movements kind of show that whether you're talking on the idea that the New Deal should be doing more, or on the conservative side that the New Deal was doing too much, there's definitely argument and debate going into the New Deal in almost every step along the way.